Now, this is the repository outline. There are basically three main areas. One is for your Lotus Notes entities, one for your OpenInsight entities, and general, which is pretty much for everything else. You can expand or contract this by double clicking, and you can just drill down through the entities. So I can double click OpenInsight, I can then go into OpenInsight form executables, and I can drill down to the form that I require. Now, we haven't created any entry forms in our application yet, so we can't look at any specific application properties for Windows that we've created, but I'll use the app backup one for the moment. Simply select it, entity and properties, and that opens up the entity properties window. We looked at this very briefly earlier on, but I want to look at it in a little bit more detail now. So behind every entity in the repository you will find its entity properties dialog window, the one that we're looking at now. This enables developers to set entity properties, access entity management features and other related entity information. The entire life cycle of the entity is managed and monitored in this particular area. It should also be noted that the user who creates the entity rows owns the entity. Only the entity owner and the application author can specify who has the ability or the rights to access, modify, update the entity, and they are also the only two users who can delete the entity from the system. So if we just look through each of these one at a time, the entity name here we had a look at just a moment ago, and that's the fully specified ID for the entity. Borrowed from, this would have a value here if the name of the parent application, if the entity is an alias. Inherited from, this is the name of the parent application if this entity is inherited. In this instance it's inherited from sysprog. Then we have the author information details and the title of our entity and the subkey. Under attribute we have the state. A 0 would mean that the entity is not currently being worked on, and a 1 means that the entity is currently being worked on. We have a shareable attribute. This enables cross-application sharing. This defaults to checked, which allows the entity to be shared. Thus, if an application inherits from this application, this entity will be available to the other application if shareable is checked. Publishable enables the entity to be published. This defaults to checked, which allows the entity to be published to application builds. Evaluate, this becomes checked when the entity has been modified and impact analysis should be run against the entity. A flag will also be displayed against the entity in the repository outline, as we saw in the earlier video. Checkout enables the entity to be checked out by a developer working in a collaborative development environment, a multi-user development copy of OpenInsight. If the entity is checked out, this will be checked and the developer will not be able to edit this entity using the system tools. Recompile, when this is checked, the entity will be set for recompilation. When the entity is recompiled, this option is then cleared. The last update section gives you two bits of information: the name of the last user to update the entity and the time that the entity was last updated. So in this instance, Eric, back in November 2009. There's also a button to run the entity history, so we can view that there, and that provides a comprehensive record of modifications to the entity since its creation. We also have an access permit button which controls which users can access the entity for use. The default is public, which is all users. We also have an update permission which controls which users can modify the entity. The default again is public, which is all users. We have a document button which lists the document type entities related to this entity. We have a description button which allows a description of the entity to be entered. There's a pointed by. This is enabled when the selected entity is a pointer entity. When it displays the entity pointed by dialog box, which displays the fully qualified identifier of the entity in its source application. That's not the case here, so it's disabled. And the last button here is the Browse button, which displays the Entity Relationship Browser, which we looked at previously. It's important to understand the uses of the properties for an entity, as they play an important role where several developers are working collaboratively on the application. Also where the entity needs to be reused or shared, or where access to the entity needs to be managed, for instance restricted, and also in monitoring and recording the life cycle of the entity. So let's just cancel out of here. Now, in addition, within the application manager, we can shift and double click on any entity and it will run that particular window, and we can just double click it and it will launch it within the OpenInsight Forms Designer. Now, the form doesn't exist in this particular application, but you'll see when we're working with our own applications, you can double click there and it will launch it within the Forms Designer for you to work on. Okay, so that's it for creating a new application. We've got a new application called Clinic, and that's the one that we'll be working with over this series of videos. Before we finish up this lesson, I've just got one more thing that I want to do here. I'm going to close down OpenInsight, and I'm going to take a copy of our shortcuts that we had before, and we'll paste that in there. I'm going to rename that as Clinic, and because I'm lazy, I'm going to set up this shortcut with some specific information. Now, I'm not going to worry about having the new IDE running, but one of the things I do want to do is I want to use the AP switch to launch the application, and the application we'll launch is going to be Clinic, and we'll set UN and have that as Clinic. Remember, this is the username. A password, which is going to be empty. Need an equals in there. And I want to open it into development mode, so we use the /DV switch. And remember, I'm very good at forgetting to turn the system monitor on, so we'll do SM equals 1, which will open up the system monitor. So if we OK that, now when we run the shortcut, the Clinic shortcut, you'll find that we go straight into the IDE that we've been working with. We've logged into our Clinic application, and I've got the system monitor running down here as well, so we're good to go. So I'd suggest you just set your shortcut up like that for the purposes of running through these quick start guides. So that's it for this lesson. The next lesson we'll be looking at creating a data table using the table builder. I look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, thanks so much for your time today. Goodbye.